All right, we will talk quarterbacks here. So starting in 1999. So that was Kirk Ferentz's first season. Of course, it was not a glorious one as he got off to a rough start, but that was fully expected. And I certainly was mighty impressed with the turnaround of this team and this program under Kirk Ferentz the first few seasons. And when we look at the quarterback position over this tenure, and I made my list. Of course, we need to hear from you first and foremost. Of course, there are a few guys that are obvious selections here if we're looking at a top 5 here. But of course, Brad Banks was the first one that really exploded on the national scene under Kirk Ferentz. So how did you determine your top 5 here?
Well, first of all, this is kind of like wide receiver. Like, these are the easier ones to do because the pool is so much smaller. I mean, Brad Banks, obviously Heisman runner-up, you put him at the top, even though his career was not as long as some other guys. I think there's some debate after that as far as what order you go with from 2 to 4. But I think clearly the next 3 are probably Stanzi. Well, not probably. They are. Stanzi, Tate, Stanley. Again, what order? That's up for debate. I know Stanley's at the top of a lot of the record books as it relates to the Ferentz era. Part of that is longevity. I think team success should be weighed. I've got Stanzi as my number 2 if we're doing this in order. I've got Banks number 1. I've got Stanzi number 2. I'll probably go with Tate number 3, simply because you look at Tate's career, and I think from a success standpoint, no, he never won a Big Ten, never won a BCS bowl, but he did have moments that we look back on, like the Capital One heroic pass to Warren Holloway that you remember. It's hard between him and Stanley. They're 2 different guys too. Tate was mobile. Stanley was very much not. But Stanley, I really like Nate Stanley was a gamer. I'm not really looking at statistics too much, but I think those are your clear top 4. And then after that, you can go a lot of different places. I would definitely go Beathard at number 5. And then I don't know where you go after that. I'm glad this is just a top 5 because like Vandenberg, from a statistics standpoint, you could argue Beathard or Vandenberg, but Vandenberg actually finished with more total yards. The problem with Vandenberg, and their numbers are very similar if you look at them. I know some people would think that I'm wrong on that, but again, go back and look at the numbers. Longevity you give to James Vandenberg. I think the disadvantage Vandenberg had was he played during an era where that offense was just so unproductive, just not a good offense not very conducive to quarterback play and numbers. And so I think Vandenberg gets a bit of a bad rap. But I do think you go Beathard. It has to be in the top 5, even though his career 2016 was not a success and he didn't get the job until 2015. Played through injury a lot of, both years, actually. So, I love CJ. I've said that before, but I don't think you can look past the Heisman runner-up of Brad Banks, the overall team success of Stanley, although I know 2015 was a successful year as it relates to number of wins. Tate, I just think Tate, Stanley, Beathard are very, very close, and even Vandenberg because of his longevity. It just depends on how you're looking at this. So, am I right there, Mark? I probably would give Beathard the nod over Vandenberg just because of team success.
So again, you are going Banks, Tate, Stanzi, Beathard, and Stanley.
I've got Banks, Stanzi. I've got Stanzi second, Tate, Stanley, Beathard. I know some people would put Beathard ahead of Stanley. I've gone back and forth on that.
Okay. I didn't think you ordered them. I thought it was just the top 5. Okay.
Oh, well, if you're asking me order, that'd probably be my order. But no.
Okay.
Yeah, so the top 5, and then my honorable mention would be James Vandenberg.
So, of course, Jake Rudock had a nice 2013 and 14 combination there, went to Michigan, but that does not count. We are looking at the numbers of James Vandenberg, and that's a really nice 2011 season, of course, 3,000 yards, 25 touchdown passes. Oh, I don't think there's any I'm right there with you in regards to those are the 5 that I had, knowing that you have been selecting a top 5 for these 2 weeks. Those were the same 5 I came up with as well.
So you wouldn't have even given Vandenberg a sniff for the top 5?
Not, I think it's notable, but I don't think
I
that
agree.
it took me no
I agree.
regard for a top 5.
I think I'm being maybe a little bit overly sympathetic to him because of the Greg Davis era and what that turned into. Now, CJ was also part of the Greg Davis era. So that is one thing. If you're going to go tiebreaker, you got to give Beathard the tiebreaker because Beathard was more productive with that staff. But I will say Vandenberg was early in that era. So, and as far as NFL success, boy, you can almost flip it, right? Like Beathard is number 1. It's not like any of these guys have had great careers in the NFL, but Beathard would be number 1. Who else has had success in the NFL? Like none of these other guys. I think Stanzi briefly made the Chiefs roster, was I think briefly on the Jacksonville roster, but I mean in general. And by the way, Kelvin Fisher says Stanzi too many pick sixes. I get it. Like the numbers in 2009 weren't great, but the dude produced. Like those were fun teams to watch. Yes, he was graced with better skill position players than some of these other guys. Certainly Beathard in 2016 did not have a receiver with a pulse, it felt like at times, with all due respect to Riley McCarron. And you could say the same thing about Vandenberg at times. His best receivers were what? Cavante Martin, Manley, Keenan Davis. So yeah, it's hard. These are so subjective. And again, it's going to be harder. When you start talking about like linebackers, offensive line, you start talking about defensive line, it's going to be harder to end up with just 5.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would settle on
these,
Vandenberg's my honorable mention.
Yes, because of the depth of those positions. But these discussions, doing wide receivers last week, doing quarterbacks this week, are more objective because not that the stats do not tell us everything by any stretch. Can't be just a stat nerd and say, okay, the best stats. You're obviously giving it a lot of context, considering offensive line play, wide receiver play or lack thereof, a lot of other conditions, big game performance, team accomplishments, but the numbers generally are 75 or 80% of the story. And
if that's the case, Mark, like what Eric said in the chat, I'm okay with the argument of Beathard over Stanley. However, there are people that will show you Stanley's numbers. He ended up with the most touchdowns in Iowa history, most passing touchdowns in Iowa history. As far as yardage is concerned, he ended up with the second most yards behind only Heisman runner-up Chuck Long. Those are pretty hard to, again, if we're looking at stats, those are pretty hard to argue.
When you look at the current quarterback situation and understanding that there's really only been one quarterback, and that's Spencer Petras, there is only 1 degree of separation, Spencer Petras being that guy, between the current quarterbacks and Nathan Stanley, and their Nate Stanley through 26 touchdowns, 2 consecutive seasons. Like he's putting up those kind of numbers. We're only 1 quarterback removed from that type of production. And,
Nate Stanley here's something notable. And I think this is a huge stat to follow. Not everything, but it's a huge stat following into this year. Not 1 year did Nate Stanley hit the 60% mark as it relates to completion percentage. And that's notable because, again, all the stats, and yet his best completion percentage was 59.4 his senior year. So, and again, Mark, go to, you've got it up there. I'll just have you do this if you don't mind. Go to Spencer Petras. You talk about his 3-year career following, right? So Stanley gets 3 years. Petras gets 3 years, one being a truncated 2020 season, but it counts. Or excuse me, I guess, am I right? 3 years. He was done in 22. Look at his numbers. Not one 60 yard or 60% number in there for a season. Certainly Deacon Hill was not at 60% last year. And I don't think, even if you want to count Cade McNamara, I don't think that's fair to do that because he played in what, 3 or 4 games, 5 games. His completion percentage in a short period of time was 51.1%. So I guess keep going back if you want to talk about full-time starters in recent history for Iowa. Go back before Nate Stanley. Go back to C.J. Beathard. Beathard in his time at Iowa had 1 year of 60% completion percentage, and that was in that 2015 run. 62% completion percentage. That's got to be the mark, right? Like 2016 was a down year. Shouldn't have been a down year because I thought they retained a lot of that talent. That's evident by the lack of draftees they had in 2016. Brought back Desmond King, brought back Beathard, etc. The last time Iowa's had a passer go for 60% on the season was 9 years ago. That's got to be the goal if you're Tim Lester. And I'd have to go back and compare those stats to what he had, what Lester had at Western Michigan. But I'm guessing he's had 60% passers almost every year, or he had them at Western. I could be wrong on that. We know what he did through the air with some wide receivers. So that's an achievable goal, I think, regardless of who's the quarterback, because I do think it's something he values.
It's a good point, and I'll make another one here that the descent of those pass completion numbers are at the same time conflicting with what's going on in the rest of college football. At the time that Drew Tate, Ricky Stanzi, those guys were completing 62% of their passes, that was a really good number. It wasn't phenomenal, but it was good. It wasn't average. It was probably better than average. It was those were good numbers to be hitting 60 and then in the low 60 percentile. There are guys all over the place that are in the high 60, 70%, 72%, 74% at a time when Iowa's completion percentage has crashed to around 50% or just above it in recent years. The rest of the nation and the proficiency of the passing game is increasing. All right, just to fill in the gaps here in the quarterback tenure under Kirk Ferentz, because I like to do this and because I did do the work here. So it started off with Scott Mullen for 1999 and 2000, hit on 53%, 2,600 yards, 11 touchdowns, 16 picks. Of course, 2 pretty bad football teams. Kyle McCann, 98 through 01, 58%, 4,100 yards, 23 TDs, 21 picks. To Banks, Nathan Chandler did some good things, 54%, 2,200 yards, 19 touchdowns, 10 picks in 03. Then Tate, whom we talked about, of course. And Drew Tate, I have fond memories of Drew Tate doing a lot of good things and being a guy that I enjoyed watching play. Jake Christensen, you mentioned him a couple weeks ago for some reason. 06 to 08, 55%, 21 TDs, 9 picks, just under 3,000 yards.
Those stats make it sound better than it was. I remember he didn't finish the 08 season. Stanzi took over for him and led him to a good bowl victory, a blowout victory over South Carolina in the Outback Bowl. And that was a pretty talented 08 team. Yeah, I mean, he was Jake Christensen was like a Brian Ferentz quarterback. Like he was in the wrong era. I don't know how the offensive staff tolerated that as long as they did.
Sean Green had a huge game in the Outback Bowl, correct?
Yeah, man, he had a huge game against Wisconsin that year too. Go back and he had like 4. I saw somebody was at Big Ten Network posted something about Sean Green's game against Wisconsin today. Yeah, he was phenomenal. He isn't being inducted into the Iowa Hawkeyes Sports Hall of Fame, I believe. I saw that a few days ago. Well-deserved after winning the Doak Walker Award in 2008. What would have been 2009? You wonder about they went 11-2 in 09, beat Georgia Tech in the Orange Bowl, lost Stanzi, but you just wonder. I mean, it's hard. You can never play that game because all kinds of things could have went differently had he come back. But, you lose him and you got to play a couple of freshmen in Adam Robinson and Brandon Wager. Had Sean Green come back in 2009, I mean, they may not have lost a game. They may have been. What would have happened if I don't? Because that was back during the best BCS era. So you tell me. They beat Northwestern, which they were already up 10-0 in that game. So assuming you have a running game and assuming every other game plays out as it did, assuming you have a run game, you beat Northwestern pretty handily, even without your quarterback and with Sean Green there. And then, I mean, I think, they went to overtime with Ohio State without their quarterback and without a solid running game. So, like, you bring in Sean Green. Okay, say they win that game, they beat Minnesota as they did anyways, and they're 12-0. What happens at that point, that year?
That's a great question, because the BCS championship game that year is between two undefeated teams. That was a undefeated Alabama team, undefeated Texas team.
So my guess is that Iowa would have went bowling at Pasadena. The problem with that year, and again, we don't know how that would have changed with Sean Green in the mix, but if we're just taking the other games as they were, a lot of close calls. Remember, they almost lost to UNI in week 1. Had 2 blocked field goals to save that game in Kinnick week 1 against the Panthers of UNI. And I mean, Arkansas State was a struggle at times that year. Blew the doors off Iowa State. Wisconsin was a pretty impressive victory. Beat Michigan under the lights. Pretty impressive there. Needed a last-second pass to Marvin McNutt against Michigan State. Needed a huge comeback at home against a Bill Lynch-coached Indiana Hoosiers team. So they were nicknamed the Cardiac Kids. I remember ESPN coined them that during the season. So, who knows how that would have changed with Sean Green. But had they been 12-0, like say you beat Northwestern, Ohio State, all the other wins are the same, they're probably not beating out an undefeated Alabama and undefeated Texas. But it would have been cool to see them in another Rose Bowl and have a chance at a 13-0 season. And then you talk about the possibility you win the Rose Bowl, and there'll be Iowa fans. There would have been Iowa fans that would have forever claimed that as a cheat for Iowa. Should have been in the national title game, but we'll never know.
I would have been right there with them. I would be hanging a banner for Iowa on our collection of, as we review all the national championship seasons. Absolutely. There's nothing else they could have done.
Was that USC or was that Oregon? Who played Ohio State?
Oregon.
Oregon.
Ohio State beat Oregon.
And was that was it Thomas? Was that who was?
Yeah, Darian Thomas was the quarterback. No, he was the quarterback. He was the quarterback after. That's a good call, though. Jeremiah Masoli was the quarterback for Oregon in that Rose Bowl.
And Ohio State won that game, didn't they?
Yes. It wasn't any kind of blowout, but they won by 9. They won by 2 scores. It was, they were pretty well in control in the fourth quarter, but it was a decent game. Absolutely. Darn Terrell Pryor. No, that was the next season, 2010.
That was the next season. No, it was that darn what's the kicker's name that made that kick in 2009? We've done this before. We've done this before. I can think of it if you give me a second.
Oh man, I should know it.
Yeah, you should know
other kickers, but I can't.
Devin Barkley. Devin
Barkley. Yeah.
I remember that call from. I got a lot of respect for the bald eagle. What's his face for ESPN, who's been calling games
Sean
forever.
McDonough.
I got a lot of respect for Sean McDonough, but that was one of the more annoying moments in the history of me watching college sports. And his voice is cracking. He's going nuts over like a 35-yard kick or something, whatever it was.
Well, it won the Big Ten championship.
I get it. I know. Had James Vandenberg not went down, stupid sack you take. You never take a sack on third down, right? Especially in overtime on the brink of field goal range or in field goal range. And isn't it ironic Iowa never learned from that? Like, how many times do we see Patriots do that and Deacon Hill do that? Like, unbelievable. But had he not done that, who knows what would have happened even with Vandenberg.
Yes, you have every right to say without your starting quarterback and losing that type of game down to the wire on the road that Iowa, you can't say it because we don't know, but it's logical to say Iowa would have won that game. You would have hated to have heard my impression of that matchup going into both games. I knew it was a big game. It was obviously the standings told me it was a big game, but I didn't think Iowa had a chance to beat Ohio State. I didn't even think about it.
With Stanzi, would you have thought differently? because they were 1 week removed from losing their first game to Northwestern without him and blowing a 10-point lead. I think that would have changed the narrative had he been healthy.
Sure, I was just being a little cocky and arrogant. That was
No,
not me
I
being
get it.
that was not being a broadcaster and approaching the game like I would here. That's me just being a fan. And
I don't think many people thought Iowa had much of a chance going into that game. I mean, hey, James Vandenberg had never started. He looked pretty bad at times against Northwestern. I mean, he was just on fire in that game. If you go back and watch it, he was just. There were people comparing the dude to Brett Favre, like the dude. And here's the problem in that game: he couldn't. Again, Iowa hasn't learned from this. He could not take anything off these passes. Like everything was a missile. I remember Trey Strauss dropping 2-3 passes, and yeah, I mean he was so accurate and made so many big plays, but almost the sad irony of that costly mistake in overtime that is sort of screams a young quarterback with inexperience. I mean, think about that, Mike. Can we just think about that moment? Here's a guy that I'd love to get on the show, James Vandenberg, kind of the forgotten guy. Hey, he didn't even make my top 5 today. But you think about James Vandenberg and that moment. Think about what it would have been like coming in, you're 9-0 against Northwestern. First of all, you blow that game, right? At home. At home, you're up 10-0 on the Wildcats, the lowly Wildcats. You blow that game. Everybody's counting you out against Ohio State. And they go play like that in the shoe and come back from 2 touchdowns down in the shoe. I mean, imagine what his pulse would have been like in overtime. It really is incredible. And he didn't look as good against Minnesota the next week. The offense struggled. The defense carried him. But I'll always remember that game as one of the more unbelievable moments where an Iowa offensive player, specifically a quarterback, like stepped up in the moment and just given, relative to the situation, played incredibly well and far exceeded expectations.